And welcome to Question Christianity, where tough questions get reasonable answers. Tonight we hope so. We hope so. You get to be the decider of that as a viewer. So, but in addition, we love to have people participate in the conversation. So be sure to throw questions or comments in the chat. Tonight we are going to be looking at Old Testament laws. We're continuing in our look at Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? But you don't have to have read the book to be here and listen in on the discussion and contribute questions or thoughts to that. So please stick around, even if you haven't read the book. But we're going to go through it a little bit as we continue in chapter 6 and probably a little bit into 7 here tonight as we just dive in. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We're gonna dive in.
So I was hoping, I know we talked about it in
wait. I did it again. I'm getting too comfortable. I'm forgetting introductions. So
everyone knows who we are. We are so famous that we don't even need introductions anymore.
Right. So we do have name tags though, so we'll just let that suffice.
All right. Okay, so I thought, even though we talked about it last time, I feel like it's important enough to at least do a brief review. And as we're looking into the Old Testament laws, it seems to me that probably the most common type of critique is the attack of hypocrisy, which is you Christians are picking and choosing this, but you're not keeping all of it. And so either keep all of it or keep none of it. And so you seem to be really holding on really tightly to that homosexuality prohibition, but then right after you go eat shellfish and touch footballs, which are made of pigskin and XYZ. So just for maybe our listeners, if you want to go back and hear a more in-depth conversation about that, I think it would be well worth it. Of course, that's my opinion. But just for those who maybe just want a touch on it, what should we say about the Old Testament laws? Do the Old Testament laws still apply to us as Christians? Anyone?
I think probably the good answer is it depends on which ones you're talking about.
Okay.
We determined last time that there's the moral law and the ceremonial law, and I think the third one would be the what's the one that I always end up forgetting? Ceremonial and moral and
some people say like health laws.
Yeah, the dietary laws.
Yeah. So why then do we get to arbitrarily say throw out the ceremonial laws? Why don't they apply to us? Why do we not keep the ceremonial laws, but we keep the moral laws?
Those were to differentiate the Jewish people as a people, kind of like we have customs in the United States. There are customs in different countries that are basically kind of core to who they are. I don't want to demean them to the point where we would look at them and say, different universities, there's different kind of traditions to that university, but there's a little bit of, it leans more that direction where these laws are to differentiate you're among these people and that you are a part of these people. I think that's a way to kind of to start to word around that and try to get an understanding of what those laws accomplish.
But I think some people might still be wondering, well, even though that might be true that the ceremonial laws were used to identify God's people, if the ceremonial laws don't apply to us anymore, why do the moral laws still apply to us?
Well, the moral laws applied to everyone, and they actually, many of them actually predated the written codified Mosaic law. the don't kill, don't steal, those sort of things. Those were more core, and they were understood to be wrong before they were codified.
By who?
Initially written by the finger of God on stone tablets. Secondarily, I think carved by Moses after he shattered them when he came down. But they were understood laws. Even the "I'm the Lord your God; you shall have no other gods before me." The idolatry was an abandoning of the God of creation.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify and make sure that we weren't saying that they existed because there were other cultures that had moral laws. Because certainly, I don't think we can ever say is that morality is just something that's culturally evolved, right? It's because other cultures had it, and then maybe the Jewish nation adopted some of them, so then they predate. But it seems like what you're saying is they existed before because God had revealed them as moral standards.
Right. I mean, we look at, again, and I'm going to talk about Genesis, the Genesis account as a much more factual account. But as we move out of the Garden of Eden after the eating of the fruit that was forbidden for them to eat, and then we move out of the Garden of Eden, we see that Abel and Cain were preparing sacrifices to God, and that in that Cain was providing a sacrifice that was not as pleasing or not sufficient, not to the level that which he was commanded, and he killed his brother. And even at that moment, we see, before it was written down, hey, thou shalt not kill, which is what, number 7 or 8 in the 10 commandments, the famous 10 commandments. It was there. He killed his brother, and he knew it was wrong. It was that the taking of a life of someone was known to be wrong. So those things were wrong before they were written down on stone tablets in Exodus.
Okay. Go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah, I think here's where we hit a pretty common objection that comes up that some of our Christian listeners may or may not be familiar with. But at this point, and I think it touches, Pete's getting down to the difference of the Christian view. But the objection that's raised here is very often the Euthyphro dilemma. Is God moral? But is morality, is something good because God wills it to be good, or is something is morality independent of God, or is it natured in God? Mm-hmm. Is what the dilemma boils down to. You want to expand on that, Annie? How does this answer that philosophical problem of where morality is rooted? Because it's either, people set it up as a dichotomy. So they set it up as either, something's moral because it's moral, or it's moral because God wills it. But it is either independent of God, or it is a part of God's directive.
Yeah, the Euthyphro dilemma basically is trying to the dilemma there is either is something good because God wills it, in which case God seems to be falling secondary to something that exists or is objectively above him. Mm-hmm. Like God is kind of looking above and going, oh, well, that's right, so then I'm going to obey it. So then he seems to not be God. Or is it good because he wills it, in which case things seem to be arbitrary. So it's either God is not God because he falls below goodness, or that his moral standards are just some arbitrary things that he makes up. So that's the nature of the dilemma.
Yeah, and I believe it's a false dilemma, primarily because it separates morality from God himself, and in reality, God is the morality. He's the
correct. Right.
He's the plumb line, so to speak.
Yeah.
In fact, you would find that more in Habakkuk, where the plumb line is God. He is His law. I don't want to go too far down that, because it's a rabbit trail that we could just spin on for days, and it would feel like we're going nowhere.
That's good. Go ahead,
Charles. You go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say that's. I'm glad you brought that up, Caleb, because that is very helpful. Because breaking the dilemma that way, so it's not that morality is arbitrary, and it's not that God is subjected to some other objective good that comes before him. He is the very essence of goodness, and so morality is true morality is a reflection of God's very nature in Himself. So you cannot separate the good from God.
Right.
Good is God. He is the standard, the origination, the embodiment, the full fidelity of. But this is really important, because what also comes with that, and this is something that we say all the time, but really has great importance and meaning, which is God's nature never changes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what does that mean for morality?
Morality being constant. It has a constant frame of reference.
Okay. So if God thinks something is good, it's not that He just happens to think it, but we're using kind of human terms here. If God thinks that something is good 10,000 years ago, is it still good today?
Mm.
Right? So it's not going to change. God's not going to go, oh yeah, I used to do that thing, but yeah, no, that's bad now. Or I used to think that was really good, but it's not so good anymore. I used to think that's bad, and now I think it's good. It's like, no, God is God. By His very definition, He doesn't change. His morality isn't changed. So that's the key. That's the real key, which is when we look at the Old Testament, we look at the Old Testament laws, and we understand the Old Testament is a covenant, right? And it has laws for a certain people at a certain time. And none of those laws apply to us as laws. That's an Old Testament. That's an old covenant. No one in this world is under the old covenant anymore. It's over. It's old, right? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that the morality that we see reflected in the Old Testament is also old, because the morality itself that's reflected in those moral laws is still morally right. So we can look at prohibitions against adultery, and we can say, look, it's not a law anymore, but it's still morally wrong. And Christians are right when they say, murder is wrong, adultery is wrong, theft is wrong. Not that they're laws. See, that's actually too archaic, and we're going to talk about that. It's too archaic to just say, well, it's wrong because there's a law against it. There's something even more deeper, which is it's wrong. All right, so that's how we can abstract it. So that's why we can say that things like adultery and homosexuality are still wrong, because God's morality doesn't change. But things like eating shellfish aren't reflections of morality, they're reflections of health code for a certain people at a certain time. And wearing two different types of material is a reflection of a cultural significance that doesn't apply to our culture anymore. It's not a moral thing. It's not immoral to wear different. Those are very clearly disambiguated when you look at the laws.
Yeah, I think that as people who object to the Old Testament begin to look at the Old Testament, if they truly take in the content of the legal, the cultural, the moral, the cultural, and the dietary laws, what they will figure out is that there were varying degrees of severity that those were held to. I mean, there was definitely a cutting off and a disassociation from people who were or at least implied that should happen. Granted, the people of Israel, they were pretty good at not following their own the laws. I mean, think about it. Literally, the law was being handed to them, and the first thing that happens when Moses comes down off the mountain is, oh, by the way, they're already breaking the law.
Right. Now that's a really interesting point, because that shows something. That's a great, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a great transition, because it illustrates something, which is, just because you have a law doesn't mean your heart's changed. Doesn't mean you want to obey it. Right? Because here it is. Okay, law. Moses comes down. Here's the law, and everyone said, "Oh, thank you. Now we'll do this perfectly from now on, because now we have the law. Now we're going to act perfectly. Our hearts are totally behind this." Wrong. It's like day one, fail. Right? And not that I'm really any much better than that. So, what can? All right. So let me say this, or ask this. When we look at the Old Testament, then, so we're gonna look at the Old Testament, and we're going to say we can see the morality reflected there. And when we see morality reflected there, we can understand that as a morality that will never change, because it's actually a reflection of God's very character and nature. However, we have a problem, because there are some things in the Old Testament which do seem morally archaic, like they're not really kind of up to standard, or it seems like they could be better. So, any thoughts about that?
I think there's a good example that maybe people can relate to today. Anybody who works for a business or a company or the government, you have a general principle that surrounds your agency and what you do and why you do it. For example, for any kind of public service, obviously, the main goal is serving the people, and that is, the goal behind having the agency in place. Mm-hmm. However, within that agency, there may be different business processes for achieving said results, or for achieving some component of that. However, if somebody's heart isn't in it, behind that big picture goal of serving people, then they're never really going to work well within the business policies, regardless of what they are. And this is kind of how I personally reflect on the law, that some of these laws were like policies. Some of them may be dictated for a very specific reason or a very specific time. If those things are out of date, as you just mentioned, maybe some of them seem out of date, maybe some of them are out of date. So just wanted to put an example on kind of a modern twist on it, if you will.
Yeah, or we could that is an example. We could look at other things just in American history, like the 14th Amendment. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed, and the slaves were freed, how did the South react to that new law? Were they like, okay, awesome, like we'll stop the war now that it's like legislation, our hearts are totally behind this? Was that what happened?
No.
Matter of fact, it took a long time before the laws affected the heart, which is a very well. Tell me what you guys think of this. So when, and I'm going to go kind of in a weird direction, but if we look at Roe versus Wade, when Roe versus Wade passed through the Supreme Court for women's right to abortion, I think any honest historian would admit that at the time, the majority of the population did not support that ruling. However, once the law was in place, so to speak, once the ruling was in place and it became, quote, legal, but it took time. It wasn't right away. It wasn't as soon as that happened. It was kind of an in-time thing. It took time, but as that was the standard for the society, then the heart slowly began to follow. People said, well, it's legal, it must be okay. It took time. It wasn't overnight. I think the same thing happened with Emancipation Proclamation, the 14th Amendment, the abolishing of, in time, Jim Crow laws, stuff like that. So I don't know what. Oh, okay, so here's the question. When we look back at the Old Testament and we see that God is instituting the laws, was it his intent that those laws would be permanent and the ideal forever?
So I just happened to pull up in a couple of different tabs in a different browser that the law's specific intention, why was it given? It was given so that it could reveal what was sin, what was contrary to God's nature. Let's see here. It's Romans. I think it's Romans. Let me scroll it. Romans 3:20 says, "For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." It's actually sin that reveals, it's the law that reveals sin to us. You go over a couple of chapters into chapter 5, verse 20. We actually hear that now the law came in. Now the law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. In other words, though the law showed how sinful we were and our sin, it was like, hey, we've got a law to break. It's like human nature to not just break one law, but we're going to do it in spades. We're going to go all out. We're going to break all of them. But we're also going to understand that our hope is dashed to pieces. But that's where God's grace came in. And then if you hop over into chapter 7, it actually says that Paul then keeps on going, says, well, then am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would never have known that coveting was wrong if the law had not said you must not covet. And but sin used this command to arouse all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there were no law, sin would not have the power. Mainly because we really wouldn't have a standard against which to rebel. Now, understand, I literally just said moments ago that a lot of these, the morality pre-existed the writing down. But the covetousness thing, that was a little bit more of an internal thing. It is really odd that in the 10 Commandments, that the 10th commandment was, "You shall not covet," which is easy to hide. I mean, I'm sitting over here looking at the painting on Charles' wall and how cool that is. And I could sit there and go, you know what, I really wish, so much so that I want it. And not only do I want it, I may sneak in and go grab it off his wall. But the covetousness, the internal, is very much an internal desire. And you'll keep going further into scripture. You see Jesus saying, hey, I'm telling you that if you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I'm saying if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery already. If you've hated your brother, you've committed murder already. And we could go into hey, maybe every single one of those covetousness and bad internal thoughts, if left unchecked, would turn into stealing, adulterous, murderous people. Sure, we could talk about that. But ultimately, what we're saying is that we inside, our reaction to the law is to serve self above God.
Okay.
And the law was there to say that we were created to serve God.
Okay, that's a good point, but I feel like some people are still kind of wondering, about the Old Testament laws, because as much as we're going to point to the morality in the Old Testament laws, there are some things there that don't seem quite moral, so to speak. Maybe they're half measures, or they're frankly archaic. So here's the question: was the Old Testament law meant to be permanent, and is it the ideal of all morality?
No. No and no.
Okay.
Permanent. The odd thing is that the permanence of some of those, again, the morality of not killing, not stealing, not worshiping other gods, those are permanent in as much as God is permanent. I would say that there's a little bit of jury is still out on the seventh day, or at least the Sabbath, or at least the Sabbath in spirit. If you look at how Jesus handled the Sabbath, it wasn't that he said, don't keep a day of rest. It's don't use that day as an excuse to not do good. But again, not to travel down that rabbit trail. Those moral components are permanent because God is permanent, but they are moral absolutes. But it is the keeping of that law that becomes what am I trying to get at? We're not trying to pursue the keeping of a law to gain favor with God.
All right, Caleb, how about you? What do you think? Were they permanent?
Yeah, so I think they served, in addition to serving the purpose Pete already talked about revealing our own lawlessness. I think there's also this other purpose of the law in that it reveals the plan for a Messiah. So a lot of those laws, I think, directly relate to the fact of here is the path, here is the way, if you will. And they are a symbology of what's to come. So in that sense, absolutely not. Once the Messiah has come, then some of those no longer have the same purpose they did. Some are replaced by new symbols. Some are not replaced at all. So yes, there is a framework behind these laws that is there for a reason, and I think we can understand that framework. And it helps when we actually sit down to study. If we can understand the framework, then when we sit down and look at a given command or a given law, it's easier to understand it through that framework rather than just looking at it as compared to today and saying, this is a horrible thing by today's standards in a modern country. We've got to look at it through that framework.
What if, for some reason, I'm just going to pose a hypothetical here. Let's say, gosh, I'm going to really rub people the wrong way. Let's say that 2024, Trump comes back, wins the presidency. There's an overwhelming majority in the Senate and the House of Republicans, and we overturn Roe versus Wade. We make homosexuality actually illegal to practice, and I don't know, whatever other things we think are morally correct, we as Christians, and we make those actual laws in the U.S. What do you think would be the result?
Aside from riots in the streets,
like all hell breaking loose, right? I mean, so I think there'd be many people who'd probably say yes and amen. And I think true biblical Christians are actually a minority in the country. There's a lot of people who call themselves Christians, but I don't really think they're true biblical Christians. And I think many of the nominal Christians, along with all the non-Christians, would absolutely reject and riot in the street. So, and probably pass all type of like sanctuary cities for X, Y, and Z, and basically rebel against that. And so the laws wouldn't apply. Like if you pass laws where the majority of the people aren't willing to follow them, then they're no good at all. Right? So you have to pass. I mean, that well, and this happens basically in any type of government society. If you upset enough people, then the people rebel and they won't follow. Right? They'll say, screw you. We're starting our own country. as much as they're able. And the more that they object to the law, the more likely they are to rebel. Okay, so if your God, because I really like what Paul Copan says here in this book, is these laws were not meant to be the permanent divine ideal. They're at a certain cultural juncture, right, where the culture at the time was pretty debased. Like if you look at the Old Testament times compared to all the cultures in the time, like it was pretty bloody and nasty. There were, they were literally cultures that were sacrificing their children in fires. Like that was not uncommon, or other types of child
burying
sacrifice.
them within the cornerstones of a foundation.
Pretty bad. If you look at slavery in that time, like it's horrible. It's horrible. It's at least as bad as anything that ever happened in the antebellum South, right? I'm not saying what happened there wasn't bad. I'm saying it's at least that bad or worse. Like it's really, really bad. And what happened in the South was absolutely really, really bad. I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm just saying it was horrible. It was a horrible time, morally speaking. And so if you're going to be a God and give a law to a people and allow them to be people with their own humanity and have some sort of freedom, you're going to have to meet them halfway, or they just won't. They'll just reject you as God. So, I think that's one of the significant points in the Old Testament is when Moses goes with the people to the foot of Mount Moriah, and here's the law. It's like, and he presents the law to the people, right? And he says, all right, here's the deal, right? And by deal, I mean, here's the blood covenant that you were entering into, like fail and die. Like but you're agreeing to it, right? It's not just here's the law that God is pushing on you and smashing on you. And if it's not at least something that you can kind of rise up to thinking you can follow, it's like, oh, okay, man, that's really hard. Like no homosexuality, like at all? Like, yeah, like it's like no child sacrifice. Are you sure? Like, all right, fine. Fine, we'll at least come up that far, right? And it says we're going to do this. It's an agreement, though. They voluntarily agree to this law. That's very important. It wasn't just an arbitrary law that God pushed down and said, do this or I'm going to kill all of you, right? It's like, here's a law. I think it's morally good because I'm God and that's a reflection of my nature. And so it is good. It's not the best law. It's the best law I think you'll follow. It's the best law I think you'll be willing to agree to and rise up from where you are, right? And so they go to Mount Moriah, and he reads the law. Moses reads the law, the lawgiver, and he says, will you do this? And they say, all this we will do. And he sprinkles blood on the people, and the people agree to the law that they're willing to agree to. Right? It's not that this law is perfect. See, I think it's a very unfair attack, and believe me, it's out there. It's an unfair attack because the Old Testament itself admits as much. Okay, so I think both of you are probably familiar with Jeremiah 31:31. If not, we can Google it. I've got my cheat notes here.
Yeah.
Where's your cheat notes, Charles?
You're aiming towards what?
It looked like Pete was finding it.
Yeah. You're aiming towards kind of what was going through my head is that I will make a new covenant. The house of Israel and the house of Judah. I believe it goes further on.
A new covenant? Wait, a new set of laws? Is that what you're saying?
Right. And at this point, we're not just saying a covenant. So not to rehash too much, we've got the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant of promise. We've got the Mosaic law, but there's this new covenant is actually not a covenant. It is the fulfilling of the covenant of Abraham's covenant, and it is the fulfillment, and I would love to revisit this phrase, the fulfillment of the law of Moses. But this new covenant is a covenant made in the blood of Christ. Literally, God saying that for the first covenant to happen, he's going to have to die for it to happen. And it says here in 32, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand and brought them out of Egypt, my covenant that they broke. He does note that they broke it. I'm reading it right there. It says, my covenant that they broke. Though I was their husband, declares the Lord, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them.
Yes, exactly. Right? It's like there's something better coming. And just for maybe some people that aren't aware, Jeremiah is Old Testament or New Testament?
Old.
Okay. Ezekiel 34:36 says that God is going to give us a new heart. Like there's going to be something better that's coming. This is absolutely understood in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament itself declares that there's going to be a better covenant coming, right? That there's going to be a better law coming. And when we know, like we're Christians, so we know. Christ says, hey, a new covenant I'm making with you. Well, surprise, surprise. We knew it was coming. We should know which one of you is going to make it. It's like Messiah's going to come. It's going to give us a new law. It's going to give us a new covenant. All right, so the Old Testament itself admits that it's temporary. That's really important because the attack that we hear sometimes from our atheist friends is that why aren't you sacrificing or why aren't you bringing your kids to the gate and stoning them, or why are you not eating shellfish? It's like, hey man, not only are we extracting the morality, but that covenant's old, and it says about itself that it's temporary. It says it's temporary. So please don't say that this thing that says it's temporary, it was meant to be permanent and forever. It says itself it's not. It's a totally unfair attack. It's like go read the rest of the Old Testament. It's in there. It's temporary. There's something better coming. So we're totally justified in saying that it's temporary because it itself says it's temporary.
One of the things you said earlier, a few moments ago, you said, a law that's out there that the people aren't willing to keep is kind of a law that's just kind of setting them up for failure. They're going to reject you as God. But notice that in that Jeremiah 31 section, I was ending with that part. For this covenant, I'll make the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their heart, meaning that I will place inside of them the desire to do these things.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thought. Is everybody breaking up? Am I breaking up? Yeah.
No, you're good. But okay. That's a gigantic point because anyone who has kids, I mean, if you tell your kid to do something, they're like, fine, and they go do it, you're like, okay, well, I'm glad you're cleaning your room because I told you. But what I really want is a change in your heart where you understand the goodness of what you're doing for its own sake. But no kid ever wants to clean the room at first. First you got to say, look, you need to clean your room. And you can explain, if you're a good parent, you'll explain to it, like, clean your room because, it's healthy and it's good to be organized and X, Y, and Z. And slowly they will grow to understand that. But as a loving parent, you don't spank them with an axe. You don't say, oh, you didn't clean your room? Well, I'm killing you now. Right. And I think that tends to be some people's view of the Old Testament. And when we say, hey, it was temporary and provisional, they go, well, why didn't God just make it perfect and permanent and enforce it from the beginning? Well, because he's a loving God. That's why.
I think it misses something else too. I think it misses the fact that if God were to reveal himself to humanity, how would he go about doing so? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we can look at Christianity and we can describe this God-man coming to earth and dying for the sins of people. If this were an event at any other point in history of a savior showing up to some random people group in some random part of the world, it would be a story that would just become some kind of mythology, and that would be the end of it. But what we have with the Old Testament is we have laws set up and laid out that set up for this coming Messiah. They point to what this Messiah is like. They point to the fact that that there are consequences for sin. So, between the sin and the guilt offering, you have to not only fix what you did with your fellow humans and how you've wronged them, but you also have to fix how you're separated from God.
Yeah, I want to. That's very interesting. You bring that up because as you were saying that, and I hadn't thought about this before, but I want to tie that into something that Pete said, because Pete earlier was talking about the second use of the law, which is the law is meant to basically get us to understand that basically we're imperfect and we need a savior, right? Totally valid point. But that's really interesting. If you don't have the heart change behind the law, then the second use of the law will never get there. So if you just like force on your kids, like go do this, go clean your room, and they're like, fine, but I hate you. Right? And then you say, fine, don't clean your room. And they're like, good, I never wanted to clean it anyway. Right? That use of the law won't cut to the heart, as it says. It's only when your people have to understand, like, this law is good. There's so many things in the Psalms, and I find it quite remarkable, actually, and somewhat taken aback when you read the Psalms. You see David delighting in the law. You're like, what? He likes rules? Actually, yeah, because he had the heart after God. It's like, I understand these aren't just a list of rules. This is a reflection of God's morality, and I love it. And it cuts me. It cuts me when I understand that I'm falling short of it. If I'm not grown from the heart, if I'm not grown from the point of just sheer obedience to moral understanding, how can I ever truly repent and be saved from what I don't really even believe is wrong? Right? So
I think it's really I think it's really telling that the way that Christ summarized the law, in fact, the way the Jewish people summarized the law, was they boiled it down into two great laws. Law number one, which he said was the greatest, was to love God above all things. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, basically with all your being. The second law, and it was funny that in the request, hey, what's the greatest law? He actually answers twice. He says the greatest law is loving God. Second law is love your neighbor as yourself, loving others. He summarized it in an attitude that necessitates action, a belief that creates an action. Maybe I should even say a faith that creates a work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think when we read, "Oh, love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength," we don't understand that at that time the word love, it just implicitly involved action. Like if you didn't have an action behind it, then what are you talking about? What do you mean love? You love me, but you're not. You haven't done anything for me lately. Like love was an action. It was like you're going to do something loving. So I'll share a small little personal story that may help a little bit. So there was a time when I was going to marriage counseling. Yes, I freely admit it, but I was talking to the counselor, and I was describing something in my family that I think was going wrong. And the counselor agreed. It was like, okay, yeah, I mean, not that there was nothing wrong with me, but I was like, look at there, I feel like, this is kind of going on, and I don't really like it. I just want to I want to flip it. I want to shut it down right now. And he goes, he said, if you're driving down the freeway at 55, you don't do a 180-degree turn, like at 55 miles an hour. You slow down, you get to the exit, you take the exit, you take the turn, and you get back on the freeway, and then you slowly start going the other way. And to try to do a 180-degree reversal is it's going to cause disaster. So, and I always remember that it's very helpful. It's like, if you see something going wrong, if you, I mean, it depends on what we're talking about in context, but there are some things that the best way is a slow but constant turning.
Well,
and I just, well, let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
And isn't that interesting that what we see in the Old Testament is not just the Pentateuch, but a slow growing. The Old Testament itself is an evolving revelation of God's character and plan. You know, it doesn't end in the book of Leviticus, right? It goes on, and we see more morality and God's character revealed in Kings and Judges and in the prophets, and you know, in the stories of Israel's rebellion. We see God's character. We see His evolving not his evolving morality, but his evolving revelation of that morality, until finally, you know, you get up to the point where he says, okay, look, we're off the exit ramp, we've turned around, and now we're ready to really start rolling with this thing about your heart, because it's really all about your heart. And we see Jesus arrive in the New Testament. So what were you going to say?
I was just going to give another example as well. I've got a friend who's done a lot of research into deconversion. And, you know, when you look at the best advice for usually parents of people who deconvert as maybe teenagers or as young adults, you know, the advice, even from those who have deconverted, is, you know, soft, caring responses. That so, you know, you think of the child who comes to their Christian parents and says, you know, I no longer believe this. I can't believe in God. I'm an atheist now, or whatever the case may be. And the worst thing you could possibly do is, just like you mentioned, is trying to turn things around right away by either throwing books at them, or yelling, or worse, or banning them from the family, or shunning, or whatever the case may be. It's the worst thing you can possibly do. But to let them know you still care about them and keep that person close, so that you can have those conversations that only come with a semi-intimate relationship with someone. So, you know, just another great example where that's very practical in terms of how it plays out. And I think it relates to what we see with the Old Testament law.
So I was this is years ago. I was in a conversation with a person that just happened to be in the Navy and was stationed on an aircraft carrier. And he says, you know, when an aircraft carrier is going just full speed ahead, if they want to turn around, if the person who's at the wheel of that vessel just yanks the wheel and just tries to turn it as hard to the left or the right as they possibly can, that vessel is going to keep going straight for miles, 50, 60, 70 miles, because it has all this weight going straight, and those rudders cannot turn that vessel that easily. In fact, it takes potentially 70 to 100 miles just to get that thing going and making the turn around. And that the circumference of that turn is gigantic. You know, so if you think about that, a lot of our actions and our behaviors and our attitudes, even when we come to Christ, even a sinner who comes to Christ says, I really believe this. There are times when you'll see somebody, I'm thinking about a friend of mine who lives down in Florida, who overnight off drugs. Now, I don't know what drugs. I really don't. It could have been marijuana, could have not been a very, very addictive personality, all those sort of things. And there are times when you see that radical transformation in an area or multiple areas of someone's life. But if you think, oh, good, he's removed all of this from me and I will sin no more. Even 1 John says you're likely going to have some struggle of sin going forward into your post coming to Christ life. And it's going to be that slow, steady working over you, which we in the Christian world, we have a word for that called sanctification. It's God working you over and changing you.
I once heard on the White Horse Sin that they said they compared that to trying to keep beach balls under the water, like you're in a swimming pool. And if you had like 2 or 3 of those you're trying to keep underwater, it's just you get one down, and just when you think you got that one nailed, the other one comes flying out of the water. It's like, I really got this sin nailed down. It's like, boom, there comes the pornography. Boom, there comes the, the pride. It's like so hard to keep them all. It's like hopeless. Okay, so I think the aircraft carrier illustration was I like that. And how many times in the Old Testament do we see God saying to the Israelites, man, you guys are just a stiff-necked people. You're so hard and resilient to change. You are so stiff-necked. Guilty as charged.
But what does it say about God in that? We're stiff-necked,
Right.
but it says that he is merciful, that his mercies are new every morning, that his mercies are always coming to us.
Yeah.
His grace is always overpouring to us. While we are stiff-necked, he is merciful.
Yep, and amen. Okay, so we're talking about aircraft carriers and U-turns and beach balls. So let's just bring it all back to the Old Testament and how can we like put rubber to the road on this thing? So what are we saying about the Old Testament? Because that's what the attack is, and I want to make sure that our listeners leave with a good understanding of how to correctly diffuse this attack. Not that we're trying to wordsmith this or anything. Like, realistically, what's the deal here? Anyone?
I'm actually looking in the book so that I can find a line that, and I can't find it. Sorry.
Okay.
We would really, I think the key is having a proper contextual understanding of these things before we judge it as a flash judgment of right, wrong. We need to understand it contextually before we can reasonably make that judgment call.
Man, I'd say like 98 to 99% of the issues that people have with the Bible are solved if they just understood what they were reading in the correct context. The book was written, each of the books in the Bible was written to a specific people group at a specific cultural time. Oh, I knew what I wanted to add something to that aircraft carrier thing. I mean, I think we three would admit that we can be stiff-necked at times. But if you look at the Israelites, not only do they have their own just human stiff-neckedness, but if you again just take a look at the cultures at the time, when they looked around at all the other cultures, and they're like, "You want us to do what?" Like, they're all doing that. All my friends are going. All my friends are drinking. All my friends are smoking pot. How come I can't smoke pot? The cultural, intercultural pressure that you guys, and that was by design too. It's like, yeah, I want you to be different. I want you to act different. I want you to be seen as different. I want you to be morally different. That pressure is to be understood. Like that, this was a hard ask, and that's really lost. It's really lost because we're New Testament. Like, New Testament's been around for like 2,000 years, and I think people absolutely take for granted the morality that our culture benefits from New Testament morality. Right, this thing about loving your neighbor, loving God with your whole heart. Atheists may reject God, but man, Western atheists are taking a lot of morality for granted that comes with the Judeo-Christian ethic, right? And it's very easy to take that for granted morality, then turn around and look at a ancient Near East culture and go like, gosh, that's horrible. We'd say, yeah, it's horrible. And I think God was going, yeah, it's horrible. But man, if I do it too fast, they're going to totally reject it. Like, this is the best that they can do, not the best that God can do. This is the best that they can do at the time if I'm going to be a loving parent and raise them up. So
yeah,
culture,
I'm
context, man.
Not finding what I was looking for.
You didn't find your quote?
That was an excellent summary, Charles.
Oh, well, thank you. All right, so we'll give Pete a chance to find his quote, and then I think
I'm giving up on it. Okay. I think I'm giving up on it. Rather the law portrays a personally interact. Oh, there we go. It's talking about how the law really is God's kind of intervening in history, It's God concerned enough to drop in, and not drop in like just a quick visit, but to actually come in and intersect human history. And that this law was, in a way, that I'm here to turn the ship, rather than just simply uh, the abandoning humanity to their vices. I'm here to come in and engage in humanity in their place in history, regardless of where it is. And to me, that gives me the encouragement that if God would jump into a part of the world which I think we would look at and say was just troubling, if not downright vicious in its inhumanity towards each other, and still behave graciously towards them. And yet we, in some ways, are far more vicious, and in some ways we're at least a lot more clinical. Maybe we're more sanitized.
Sanitize in our viciousness.
And we are, and
We
yet
keep our abortion clinics very sterile, very
sterile,
healthy places. Yeah.
But what I would say is that God is still willing to intersect and interact with me in my spot in humanity, in my spot in history.
So
right.
We've bounced this around a lot, Charles. Is there a fallacy lying behind all this thinking?
Well, I was hoping that we could close on the is ought fallacy, and just as another defense against an attack that we sometimes hear, which is, I mean, I think by anyone's admission, there are things that are done by Israelites in the Old Testament that are morally abhorrent. And so, well, what is the is ought fallacy? So, well, let's start with that. What is the is ought fallacy? Anyone?
Right. So that's when we make an assumption that because things are a certain way, that's the way they should be. We see things in the world today. Things are.
We've always done it. We always did it that way.
Right. Things are going, or things are even going better now than they were in the past. So this must be right.
Yeah. Yeah. Think about the antebellum South. We've always had slaves. You know, slaves, man. We've always had. Slavery's been around forever. Must be good. Nope. Okay. So now
I always heard it called the staying the course fallacy.
Yeah. Right. It's not true on any side, right? Just because we've been doing it for a while doesn't mean it's good, and just because we've been doing it for a while doesn't mean it's bad, right? Things need to be judged by what they are in and of themselves, not how long we've been doing them. All right, so to that point, I just want to admit for our listeners, and I would hope that our listeners could admit to anyone that they're talking to, that we see plenty of things in the Old Testament that we should freely admit are absolutely horrible. They need no defense. They're bad, right? Sacrificing your daughter, making an oath that whatever you see come out of your front door coming home from battle is whatever you're going to sacrifice, and it turns out to be your daughter. And so, well, sure enough, you got to burn her alive. Like, bad. That's bad. There's nothing in that account that says that was a good thing. It's just that something he did, and there's probably a moral lesson that we need to learn from being rash in our oaths. So is ought fallacy, because we see it doesn't mean it's good. We need to really be, as Caleb said, looking at the context, understanding that this might not be something that's shown as good. It might actually be shown as something that's bad. Comments on that? All right, great.
Yeah, I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up. Next week, or I guess 2 weeks from now, we'll continue. We'll dive into chapter 7 more.
Yeah, if you guys want to read ahead.
It'll be a great place to pick up right where this discussion left off, and we'll be continuing. So if you enjoyed this tonight, be sure to hit the notification bell so that you get notified when we're going to go live again and have this next discussion. bring your questions. We want to hear what Old
Yeah, no
Testament
questions.
laws are the ones that give you the most trouble. Which one's most problematic? Throw it in the comments. Let us hear. We'll address it in one of the shows. So, yeah, thanks for watching. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Have a great night.